The cold street night air was sharp, biting at the skin of anyone who dared to walk without a thick coat. The city looked alive on the surface lights glowing from tall buildings, car horns echoing, neon signs flashing with promises of food, drinks, and warmth. But underneath all that brightness, there were dark corners, shadows where the cold seemed even deeper, and silence heavier. Daniel Carter walked along one of those streets. His black coat was expensive, made of wool, the kind of coat most people would never own. His leather shoes clicked against the wet pavement, polished so much they reflected the streetlights. He looked like a man who had everything: money, power, a name that appeared in magazines and business news. People often described him as untouchable, successful, a man who had conquered the world. But as Daniel walked alone that night, he felt none of it. Inside, there was only emptiness. He had meetings during the day, dinners in glittering restaurants, photos taken at charity events, but when he returned home, silence greeted him, no laughter, no one waiting to ask how his day had been, just empty rooms filled with expensive furniture that meant nothing. The street he walked now was different from his usual path. He had taken a turn to avoid the traffic. The shops here were older. Some shutters were closed, some windows cracked. The bakery on the corner had its lights off, a faint smell of stale bread still escaping through the gaps. Trash bins overflowed, and the cold made the smell even sharper. That was when Daniel noticed him. A small figure sat on the stone steps of the bakery. At first, Daniel thought it was just a bundle of old clothes. But then the figure moved. A boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. His sweater was torn, sleeves too short to cover his thin wrists. His jeans had holes at the knees. His shoes were mismatched, one too big, one too small. His hair was messy, his face pale, and his lips trembled from the cold. Daniel slowed his steps. Something pulled at him, something he hadn't felt in years. The boy was holding a piece of bread, old and dry, broken in half. He cupped it in his small hands as if it were a treasure, staring at it before taking the tiniest bite. He chewed slowly, carefully, like he wanted the piece to last as long as possible. The sight pierced Daniel's heart. The noise of the city, the cars, the chatter, the music from a distant bar suddenly faded. Daniel only heard the sound of his own breathing and the faint crunch of the bread in the boy's mouth. For a moment, Daniel was no longer a millionaire. He was a child again. He saw a cramped apartment with peeling paint on the walls. He remembered sitting at a wooden table with his mother, a tired woman with gentle eyes. He remembered nights when there was only rice with a pinch of salt, and his mother would smile and say, "It's enough, Danny. As long as we share, it's enough." Daniel blinked, and the memory disappeared, replaced by the cold street in front of him. His throat tightened. He wanted to look away, to keep walking, but his feet refused. Something about the boy's small figure, his silent battle against hunger and loneliness, forced Daniel to stop. The boy must have felt his eyes, because he looked up. Their gazes met. Daniel saw fear first, a quick flicker like the boy expected, to be shouted at or chased away. But then the boy's eyes softened, dark and tired yet strangely bright, like a candle that refused to die. Daniel's chest ached. He didn't know why. He had seen homeless people before. He had donated money, written checks, SPONSO or ED shelters, but he had never stood this close, never looked into eyes like these. The boy shifted, as if ready to hide the bread, but then he did something Daniel never expected. He held the bread out, half of it, his small hand trembling in the cold. His voice was so soft that Daniel almost missed it, but he heard the words clearly. "It's all I have, but you can share." Daniel froze. His heart pounded against his ribs. He couldn't speak. This boy, who had nothing, was offering him the only piece of food he had. Daniel's breath came out in a sharp cloud. The street suddenly felt colder, sharper, heavier. He wanted to say something, anything, but his voice was stuck in his throat. The boy kept holding the bread, his arm trembling now from both fear and cold. His eyes never left Daniel's, as if waiting to see whether this tall stranger in a fine coat would accept or reject his tiny act of kindness. Daniel slowly reached out. His hand shook, not from cold, but from something deeper: shame, sorrow, memories. He took the bread, not because he was hungry, but because refusing it would have broken something in the boy's fragile courage. The bread was dry against his fingers. He lifted it to his lips and took a small bite. The taste was nothing, plain, stale, almost like chewing paper. Yet to Daniel, it was heavier than any meal he had ever eaten in a golden dining hall. Tears burned in his eyes, but he blinked them away quickly. He could not let the boy see him break, but inside, he already had. The whisper. Daniel sat frozen on the cold step, the half piece of bread heavy in his hand. The boy's words echoed in his ears, soft yet powerful. It's all I have, but you can share. For a moment, Daniel could not move. His chest felt tight, as if something invisible had wrapped around his heart. He had been in boardrooms with the richest men, had walked through mansions with glittering chandeliers, had signed deals that shook entire companies, yet never, not once, had words struck him like this, gentle, simple, from a hungry child offering him half of nothing. The wind blew down the empty street, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from a vendor's stall. The boy shivered, pulling his thin sweater closer around his small body. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his lips cracked, but his eyes were steady, waiting for Daniel's response. Daniel finally managed to swallow. He forced his voice to work. Why would you share this with me? He asked softly, his breath forming white clouds in the air. The boy's fingers tightened around the other half of bread. He shrugged, his shoulders rising like fragile wings. Because you look sad, he whispered. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. Daniel's throat burned. He almost laughed, but not from amusement, more from disbelief. Him, sad? He was the man people envied, the man whose photos appeared beside headlines about success and fortune. But this boy, with nothing but broken shoes and half a piece of bread, had looked at him once and seen the truth. I'm fine, Daniel said quickly. Don't worry about me. But the boy only tilted his head, as if he could see right through the lie. For a long moment, neither spoke. The city moved around them, cars speeding past the intersection, a bus stopping with a hiss. Distant footsteps on the other side of the street, but the little corner felt like another world, cut off from everything. Finally, Daniel asked, "What's your name?" "Eli," the boy said after a pause. He held the bread close, as though it were his only protection. Daniel repeated the name quietly, tasting the sound. Eli. It was simple, strong, and it carried a strange weight. "Do you have anyone?" Daniel asked carefully. "Parents? Family?" Eli's eyes dropped to the ground. He kicked at the step with the tip of his shoe, leaving a faint scrape. His silence was louder than any answer. Daniel felt his stomach twist. He knew that silence. He had lived it before, when his father left, when his mother worked late nights, and he sat alone at the kitchen table waiting for food that sometimes never came. He remembered staring at an empty plate, pretending it was full just so he could trick his mind into feeling less hungry. His mother's voice returned to him in a rush. "We may have little, Danny, but we share, always share." Daniel looked at the boy again. Ellie's face was pale, but his eyes, those deep, dark eyes, held a strength Daniel could not explain, a strength that came from pain, from learning too young that the world did not always care. "Do you sleep here?" Daniel asked gently. Eli nodded once, his chin barely moving. "Sometimes here, sometimes there." He pointed vaguely down the street. "Depends." Daniel's chest tightened again. He imagined this boy, alone in the freezing night, moving from corner to corner, hiding from strangers, fighting hunger with scraps of bread. The thought stabbed through him like ice. "You shouldn't be out here," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself. "It's too cold." Eli gave a small shrug, the kind of shrug that said, "This is normal for me." Then, after a pause, he looked at Daniel with quiet curiosity. "Why are you here?" Eli asked. The question startled him. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. Why was he there? He had walked away from his chauffeur-driven car, away from his warm penthouse, because he couldn't stand the silence inside. He had wandered without direction, ending up on this forgotten street. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. His voice was rougher than he intended. Eli studied him, then nodded slowly. As if that answer was enough, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Something heavy that had been locked away for years. Sitting here with this boy, he did not feel like the powerful man people admired. He felt human again, vulnerable, broken, seen. The bread in his hand was dry and tasteless, but he forced himself to take another bite. Eli watched, and a faint smile flickered across his face, so small it might have been missed. But Daniel saw it. It was a smile of trust, of relief that his offer had been accepted. That tiny smile shattered something inside Daniel. He thought of all the times he had walked past people like Eli. He had written checks, yes, but always from a distance, always with a wall between him and their suffering. He had told himself he was helping, but maybe he had only been buying comfort for his conscience. But tonight, that wall was gone, and in its place was a boy with nothing but a torn sweater and half a piece of bread. Yet he had given Daniel more than anyone ever had, kindness without reason. The night grew colder. Daniel could feel it creeping into his bones, but he didn't move. He sat beside Eli, the city rushing on without them, as if time itself had paused to watch. And for the first time in years, Daniel Carter felt small tears gather at the corner of his eyes, not from failure, not from loss in business, but from the soft whisper of a child who had nothing and yet gave everything. The forgotten past city clock struck midnight in the distance, its chimes echoing faintly through the cold air. Daniel sat on the bakery steps beside Eli, feeling as though the whole world had faded into silence. Only the boy's small figure, the piece of bread, and the sharp cold wind seemed real. For years, Daniel had buried his past under layers of wealth. He had told himself he would never look back, never remember the nights of hunger or the years of loneliness. But sitting here, next to this boy, the walls inside him began to crack. Memories he had locked away came flooding back like an old wound reopening. He remembered being 10 years old, sitting in a dimly lit kitchen. The wallpaper was peeling, the bulb above the table flickered, and the air smelled faintly of dampness. His mother had worked late again, and he had waited at the table with an empty plate, trying not to cry. When she finally came home, exhausted and thin, she carried a small bag of rice. She boiled it quickly, added only salt, and sat beside him. She smiled, though her eyes were tired. "We don't have much, Danny," she had whispered, "but we share, always share." And she had given him most of the rice, pretending she wasn't hungry. Daniel blinked, forcing the memory back into the shadows of his mind. But Ellie's thin hands, clutching that bread, had torn open the lock he had built over his childhood. He looked at the boy. Eli was chewing slowly again, careful to make each bite last. His cheeks were hollow, his wrists small, but there was a quiet strength in the way he sat. Daniel could see it. It was the same strength his mother had carried, the strength of those who endured without complaint. "Eli," Daniel said softly, his breath fogging the air, "how long have you been out here?" The boy shrugged. "A while." His voice was flat, practiced, as if he had learned not to measure time because it would only hurt more. Daniel pressed gently. "And before this, where were you?" Ellie's eyes shifted toward the ground. His lips parted, but no words came for a long time. He only stared at the cracked pavement as if it could hide him. Finally, he whispered, "I had a home once, but then it went away." The words were simple, but Daniel felt them like knives. A home, gone. He could imagine the rest without details: arguments, poverty, maybe death. He didn't ask more. He could see in the boy's silence that the pain was too heavy to describe. Daniel leaned back against the cold stone wall. Above them, the streetlight flickered, casting shadows across Ellie's face. The boy's eyes looked older than his years, as though he had seen too much of life too soon. "I know what it feels like," Daniel said quietly, "to lose things, to feel like the world doesn't care." Eli turned his head slowly, studying him with cautious eyes. "You," Daniel gave a faint, bitter smile. "Me, a long time ago. I didn't have much either. My mother and I, we struggled. There were days we didn't know if we would eat." The boy's eyes widened slightly. "But you're rich." He said the word almost like it was a storybook thing, something distant and unreal. Daniel let out a small sigh. "Yes, I am now. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten the hunger or the cold." Eli stared at him for a long moment, as though trying to imagine this man in a fine coat sitting on a broken step, with nothing but an empty stomach. Slowly, his expression softened, and he nodded. For the first time, Daniel felt the smallest thread of trust forming between them. The wind grew stronger, sweeping down the street. Eli shivered, pulling his torn sweater tighter. Daniel noticed how thin the fabric was, how the boy's shoulders shook. He felt a sharp pain in his chest. Without thinking, he slipped his coat off and placed it around Ellie's small frame. Ellie's eyes shot up in surprise. "But it's yours." Daniel shook his head. "It's just a coat. You needed more." For a second, Eli hesitated. Then he pulled the coat closer. burying his face into the soft warmth. His small body relaxed slightly, and Daniel saw a look on his face that broke him, a look of relief so deep it was almost painful. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different, softer, warmer. Daniel stared at the boy, and deep inside, a question began to form. A dangerous question. What if I don't walk away this time? He had walked away before. From beggars on corners, from children selling flowers at traffic lights, from old men shaking tin cups. He had told himself he couldn't save everyone. He had convinced himself writing checks to charities was enough. But looking at Eli, he realized this was different. This wasn't about saving everyone. This was about not abandoning the one child in front of him. Daniel's chest rose and fell heavily. He was a man used to decisions fast, sharp, calculated. But this decision was not about numbers. It was about heart. Eli broke the silence first. His voice was a whisper, almost lost to the wind. Thank you. Daniel swallowed hard. Don't thank me, he said. Not yet. The boy tilted his head, confused. But Daniel looked away, staring into the night sky where no stars were visible. Only clouds and city smoke. Inside his heart, something long buried was stirring again, the memory of a promise he once made to himself as a boy. If I ever escape this life, I will never forget those who are still trapped in it. And now, sitting on a cold street beside a child with nothing, Daniel realized he had forgotten. Until tonight. The choice at night deepened, and the streets grew quieter. Shops had closed, their shutters rattling as the wind pushed against them. A lonely street lamp flickered above, throwing pale light over Daniel and Eli sitting side by side on the cold bakery steps. Daniel's coat swallowed the boy's thin frame. Ellie's eyes were half closed now, the weariness of someone too young to carry so much burden. He leaned slightly against the wall, clutching the bread in his hand as if afraid it might vanish. Daniel watched him in silence. His mind spun like a wheel, pulling him in two directions. One side whispered the voice of logic, the voice that had built his empire. This is not your problem. You can't save every child. Walk away. The other side, softer but stronger, was the voice of memory, his mother's voice. Never turn away from someone in need. If you have enough, you share. He looked at Eli again. The boy's face was peaceful now, though too thin, too tired, and in that moment, Daniel realized the truth. This wasn't about saving everyone. This was about saving one. But still, he hesitated. Inside him, old fears rose. He remembered the first time he had given a large donation to a shelter. He had felt good for a moment, but later, when he visited, he saw chaos. The money had been misused, the children still hungry. He had felt cheated, helpless. Since then, he had built walls, writing checks but never getting close, telling himself it was safer not to feel. And yet, here he was, his heart breaking at the sight of one boy. Daniel rubbed his forehead. He was Daniel Carter, the man who made decisions in seconds, where to invest millions, which company to buy, which to close. But this decision felt heavier than any deal he had ever signed. Do I leave, or do I stay? Eli stirred beside him. His small voice broke the silence. Are you leaving? He asked softly, his words barely audible. Daniel froze. The question cut through him. He looked down and saw Ellie's eyes watching him, tired, cautious, but filled with something fragile. Hope? No, Daniel said finally, his voice firm. Not yet. Eli blinked, surprised. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, a tiny smile touched his lips. It wasn't wide, but it was real. Daniel felt it pierce straight into him. Good, Eli whispered. Before resting his head back against the wall, Daniel's chest tightened. That one word, good, was more powerful than any applause he had received at boardrooms or at charity galas. It was trust, and trust was something money could never buy. He leaned back against the cold stone, staring at the empty street. His thoughts drifted again, unwillingly, to the past. He remembered a night long ago when he was just a boy. His mother had come home late, her hands red from cleaning houses. She had found him crying quietly at the kitchen table. He had been ashamed of his hunger, ashamed of his tears, but she had pulled him close, kissed his forehead, and whispered, one day, Danny, when you're strong enough, promise me you'll never let another child feel like this. That promise had been buried under years of ambition, but tonight, Ellie's presence had dug it out. Raw and alive. Daniel looked at the boy again. Ellie's breathing had slowed, Sleep was tugging at him. His small hands clutched the bread still, even in rest, as though it was the last piece of safety he had in the world. The sight broke Daniel's hesitation. The decision was no longer a question. "I won't walk away this time," he murmured, more to himself than to Eli. The words hung in the cold air, like a vow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. For a moment, he stared at the screen, hesitating. Who could he call? His driver? His assistant? No, this wasn't about business. This wasn't about convenience. This was about him. He put the phone back and made a different choice, one he never made. He decided to act with his own hands. Daniel gently touched Ellie's shoulder. The boy stirred, blinking up at him with tired eyes. "Eli," Daniel said softly, "how about we find somewhere warm tonight?" The boy frowned, uncertain. "Warm? Yes." Daniel nodded. "Somewhere better than these steps. A bed, food, heat." Ellie's eyes widened slightly, suspicion flickering there. He had probably heard promises before, empty ones. His voice was cautious. "Why?" Daniel paused. The question stabbed deep. Why indeed? He could have said 100 things. He could have explained his past, his guilt, his loneliness, but instead, he simply said, "Because no child should be alone in the cold." Eli studied him for a long moment, his small hands gripping the bread tighter. Then, slowly, he gave a little nod. Daniel stood and offered his hand. Eli stared at it, hesitant, then placed his thin fingers into Daniel's palm. The warmth of that tiny hand, fragile but alive, sent a shiver through him. It felt like holding not just a child's hand, but a piece of his own forgotten soul. As they rose from the bakery steps, Daniel knew something had shifted forever. He wasn't just helping a stranger. He was answering the echo of his mother's voice, fulfilling a promise he had buried but never truly forgotten. The choice was made, and for the first time in years, Daniel Carter felt not like a millionaire, not like a businessman, but like a human being capable of love. Do you want me to begin part 5? The warm shelter 800th warm sheltered night stretched on as Daniel and Eli walked slowly through the empty streets. The boy's hand was small in Daniel's, cold, fragile, yet clinging tightly, as if afraid Daniel might vanish if he let go. The city lights flickered in the puddles, neon signs glowing faintly above shuttered shops. A gust of wind swept through, carrying with it the bitter smell of smoke and garbage, but Daniel barely noticed. His attention was on the child beside him. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't thinking about stocks, meetings, or contracts. He wasn't calculating profit or loss. His mind was filled only with one thought: get this boy somewhere safe. Eli stumbled a little as they walked, his body weary from exhaustion. Daniel slowed his pace. "Are you all right?" Eli nodded quickly, though his steps told a different story. His thin legs trembled with each movement, and the bread he still clutched in his other hand looked harder and smaller now, as if it had been with him the long dot. Daniel looked around. He knew of a nearby shelter, one of the many places he had donated money to over the years. He had never stepped inside. He had never wanted to. It had been easier to write checks than to face the pain up close, but tonight was different. Tonight, it wasn't about donations, it was about Eli. They turned a corner, and in the distance, Daniel saw it, a squat brick building with a faded sign. A warm yellow glow spilled from the windows, cutting into the darkness. The faint sound of voices carried through the cold air, murmurs, laughter, the clatter of dishes. Eli stopped in his tracks, his eyes fixed on the building, his body stiff. "What is it?" Daniel asked gently. The boy's voice was low, uneasy. "That place, sometimes they don't let me in." Daniel's heart sank. He crouched down so he could look into Ellie's eyes. "You'll get in tonight," he said firmly. "You're not alone this time. You're with me." Eli blinked, his lips parting as if he wanted to believe, but couldn't. He glanced at the building again, doubt clouding his young face. Daniel squeezed his hand. "Trust me." Together, they approached the door. The wooden sign above read, "St. Mary's Night Shelter." The door creaked as Daniel pushed it open. Warmth spilled over them instantly, heat from radiators, the smell of soup, the soft hum of conversation. The contrast to the freezing street was so sharp that Eli shivered, not from cold this time, but from sudden relief. Inside, rows of tables were set up. Volunteers in simple aprons moved between them, serving bowls of soup and slices of bread. A group of children huddled together at one table, their eyes tired, but faces soft with comfort. Old coats and blankets hung from hooks on the wall. It wasn't luxury, but it was warmth. It was safety. One of the volunteers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up as they entered. She froze for a moment when she recognized Daniel Carter, the millionaire whose face had appeared in newspapers with giant donation checks. But instead of the usual polished businessman, she saw a man with his coat draped over a thin boy, his hand wrapped protectively around the child's. "Mr. Carter," she said, startled. "We didn't expect." Daniel shook his head quickly. "I'm not here as Mr. Carter tonight. I'm just here." He glanced down at Eli. "This boy needs a place." The woman's eyes softened as she looked at Eli. She bent down and smiled gently. "Of course. Come in, sweetheart. We'll get you food and a bed." Ellie's grip on Daniel's hand tightened, his eyes wide and uncertain. Daniel bent down and whispered, "It's all right. You're safe here." The boy hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. He allowed the woman to lead him to a table. When she placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of him, Eli stared at it for a moment as if it were unreal. Then, with careful movements, he picked up the spoon. Daniel sat across from him, watching. The boy took his first sip of soup, and his eyes closed, his whole face softening with relief. It was just a simple broth, but to him, it was everything. Daniel's throat tightened again. Memories returned unbidden, his mother placing a bowl of watery soup in front of him. When he was a boy, her own stomach empty while she smiled and said, "Eat, Danny. It's enough for both of us." Daniel blinked hard, forcing the tears back. Eli looked up between spoonfuls. "Is this really for me?" Daniel nodded. "All of it." Eli frowned in wonder, as if the idea of having food that belonged only to him was too strange to believe. For the next hour, Daniel stayed by his side. Eli ate slowly, carefully, his eyes darting now and then to make sure no one would take the food away. When he finished, volunteers guided him to a cot in a quiet corner. The bed was small, covered with clean sheets and a blanket. Eli hesitated before lying down. He clutched Daniel's coat around him like a shield. His eyes looked up at Daniel, full of questions. He didn't speak. "Sleep," Daniel whispered. "I'll be right here." And for the first time that night, Eli let himself relax. His breathing slowed, his face softened, and soon he was asleep. Daniel sat on a nearby chair, watching the boy. The shelter was warm, but inside him, something deeper stirred, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. A warmth not from heaters or blankets, but from doing what his mother had once taught him, sharing. He realized then that this night, this boy had changed him. He had entered as a man searching for escape from his own emptiness. He had found instead a fragile life that pulled him back to his own forgotten humanity. And as Eli slept peacefully for the first time in who knew how long, Daniel Carter knew one truth with absolute clarity. This was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The new dawn's first light of morning crept slowly through the narrow shelter windows. The yellow glow painted the old brick walls in soft colors, chasing away the shadows of the long night. Outside, the city stirred awake, cars honked distantly. Vendors set up their stalls, and the hum of life returned. Inside the shelter, it was quiet. Cots lined the room, most still occupied by those who had nowhere else to go. Volunteers whispered to one another as they set out more bowls of porridge and bread for breakfast. Daniel hadn't slept. He sat in the same wooden chair where he had kept watch through the night, his eyes fixed on the small figure curled beneath the blanket. Ellie's chest rose and fell steadily. His lips were parted slightly, and his fingers still clutched Daniel's coat as though letting go would mean losing safety. Daniel felt something stir in him, an ache, but not the empty kind he had carried for years. This ache was alive. It was the ache of responsibility, of connection. It was the reminder of a vow he had once made as a boy. "If I ever escape this life, I'll never forget those still trapped in it." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He thought of his mother again. He imagined her smile if she could see him now, not the millionaire sitting at a glossy table, but the man keeping watch over a child who had nothing. For the first time in decades, Daniel felt he was honoring her. The blanket rustled. Eli stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked at the unfamiliar room, then at Daniel. For a moment, fear flickered in his face, but when he saw the man still there, still waiting, it faded. "You stayed," Eli whispered, his voice hoarse from sleep. Daniel gave a small smile. "I told you I would." Eli sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. The blanket slipped from his shoulders, and he shivered a little before pulling it back. He looked around the shelter, then back at Daniel. Are we leaving? Daniel hesitated. This was the moment. The choice he had made in his heart last night now needed to be spoken. He leaned closer. Eli, he said gently, you don't have to go back to the streets. Not anymore. If you'll let me, I want to help you. I want to give you more than just a meal or a bed for the night. I want to give you a home. Eli froze. His wide eyes searched Daniel's face as if trying to catch a trick, a hidden condition. A home, he repeated, his voice trembling. Daniel nodded. Yes, a place where you're warm, where you don't have to fight for food, where you can sleep without fear. The boy's small hands tightened on the blanket. He looked down, his lips pressing together. Why? He asked finally. Why would you do that? For me? Daniel's throat tightened. He could have given many answers because he was rich, because he could afford it, because it was the right thing to do. But none of those were true enough. He reached out, carefully, lifting Ellie's chin so their eyes met. Because once, I was you, Daniel said softly. And someone my mother taught me that when you have enough, you share. Last night, you had nothing, and still, you shared with me. That's more than most people ever do. You reminded me of who I really am, and I can't walk away from that. Eli blinked rapidly, his lips trembled, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with a suddenness that caught Daniel off guard, the boy leaned forward and threw his thin arms around him. Daniel froze, then slowly wrapped his own arms around Eli, holding him tightly. The boy's small body shook with quiet sobs against his chest. Daniel closed his eyes, his own tears finally falling. It had been years since anyone had held him like this, not for business, not for appearances, but simply because they needed each other. The embrace lasted long, until Ellie's sobs softened into quiet breaths. When they pulled apart, the boy wiped his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed. Daniel smiled gently and ruffled his messy hair. Come on, he said. Let's get some breakfast. Then we'll go home. The word hung in the air, fragile yet full of promise. Later, as they stepped out of the shelter into the crisp morning air, the sun had risen fully. Its golden light spilled over the wet streets, turning every puddle into liquid fire. Eli walked beside Daniel, still wrapped in his coat, still holding the last crust of bread he had saved from the night before Dot at the corner. Eli looked up at Daniel. Do you think I could go to school like other kids? Daniel stopped, looking down at him. His chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't from pain, it was from hope. Yes, he said firmly, you will. You'll have everything you need, not because of what you don't have, Eli, but because of who you are. You're stronger than anyone I've met. Ellie's lips curved into a small, shy smile, and for Daniel, that smile was worth more than all the wealth he had ever gathered. They walked on together, a man who had thought he had everything but was empty, and a boy who had nothing yet had given everything. And as the morning sun warmed their faces, Daniel knew this was not the end of a single night's kindness. It was the beginning of a new life for Eli, for him, for the promise of love. Rediscovered, the millionaire had been shattered by a whisper, but from the pieces, something greater had been built. Family.